So I think that will leave me, and that will set up the first part of this talk, because what I have done is really to show us inclusion in Singapore. That Singapore today is very inclusive in the sense that the government has been doing a lot of things to make the space more inclusive, right? So policies, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of government commitment, money, in terms of the concrete actions that is being done. So Singapore today is inclusive, okay? But I think at the same time, I also want to ask this kind of questions. How have things come to be? How have things come to be inclusive today? Right? Are these a result of government initiatives? Is it just because the government decided to act, hence we have an inclusive Singapore? So should we think about how things have evolved in Singapore, and then looking at it from for instance, a historical perspective, what are some lessons that we can take from this approach? And in fact, this is really my earlier research that I was working with Dr. Sai during my first bachelor's and master's. Is really about how can we trace the history of disability in Singapore by looking at it from 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and then seeing how have things changed. So who were the people who effected the change? So it's quite historical in a sense. So I will try to talk about it in a very factual manner. I will talk about theory, but I will try to talk a little bit about theory through telling some of the stories that I've highlighted. So the facts that I've highlighted, then we can talk a little bit about some of the latest theories that have been bound. But I will try to keep it less theoretical, more factual in a sense. Okay. So the first picture, the first few pictures are really pictures that I think I would like to ask people, when you look at this, what comes to mind? These are all pictures of people with disabilities, right? So what's the kind of attitude that comes to mind?
This is not Singapore.
This is definitely not Singapore. I think this is actually Singapore. This is probably Indonesia. But I think it's very hard to find historical images of the 40s and 50s. But what I want to say is that actually these images are very typical representations of what we people really think about when we think about disability, right? And the words up there are really words that I think are the first things that come to mind. That we think of charity, when we think of sympathy, we think of pity. And I don't know whether that's the same in Taiwan. Is it the same? That when you think of people with disabilities, first thing about 这个人很惨很可怜，我们要帮他 ，right? Yeah, so it's a very tragic more. Link it back to disability theory. Then is what we call the individual model of disability, where that person's lack of certain bodily parts creates that distinction between who we are as a normal population and what they are, right? So, in fact, I want to make the point that even today in Singapore, we still have this kind of attitudes, right? And I'm going to show you something that was created by the same agency that has that whole stories about Wan Yi and Dixon. Remember the two disabled people that I talked about? The dancer, the one who aspires to be a dancer with Down syndrome, and then the blind person who is a computer programmer. This was the same. The next picture will be also created by the same organization, and this is it. This was the same. This was a series of advertisements made by the NCSS, the 福利委员会, and this was done in I think 2013, 2014, right? And they were trying to promote people to become social workers. So you can see it says hopeless, basically what if not for a professional social worker, and the image is of two persons with disabilities and then a social worker, obviously, right? And the idea is that if you are disabled, you will be hopeless, right? If not for the social worker, right? And this kind of idea of charity or sympathy or welfare or pity still exists in Singapore even up to a few years ago. And that's why it's very important that we always that I think that it's always important that we go back to the past and see how we have changed things and who have been responsible for the change. Okay? So let's go back a bit more and into time and look at how Singapore has evolved our thinking of disability. So what I want to say is this, that actually before the Second World War, the welfare of disabled people was actually left to the community and to administer. So the colonial government, the British colonial government, didn't really do much. It just left it to the community to do whatever they needed to do to help people with disabilities. It was only after the war that they started to institutionalize welfare for people with disabilities. Right? So what happened was the war actually created, the Second World War created a lot of devastation, and also because Singapore was occupied by the Japanese. So immediately after the war, what they did was they set up the Social Welfare Department in 1946. Right? At the same time, the community was also started setting up voluntary welfare organizations, charities. Right? So you see a lot of the charities that help people with disabilities, they were actually set up immediately after the war. And what they did was really to try to alleviate the suffering done during the war. Right? So the Singapore Association for the Blind, the Association for the Deaf, and even the Society for Aid to the Paralyzed, they were set up during this period. What we have here in this picture is of the governor of Singapore, the British governor. I think in, let me see, 1952, he was actually laying John Nichol, laying the foundation stone for the building of a home for disabled children. Right? So that kind of, so what I want to say is that immediately after the war, the 1940s, 50s, and even up to the early 60s, the first thing that came to mind was to care for people with disabilities. And this didn't depart very far from the idea of charity, of sympathy, of welfare of people with disabilities.
So the war did increase the population of disabilities?
Definitely. But okay, so that's a very good question, and I want to deviate a little bit from there because the main issue in Singapore today, as well as in the past, is that there are no numbers of people with disabilities. Yeah, so we do not know for sure exactly how many people with disabilities there are in Singapore. Our guess is always just a guess. If you look up the enabling Masterplan, which is the government Masterplan, they guess that it's 3%. Yeah, but that's something that I can talk more about later because I think it deviates a lot from, and it's a main grounds that I have of disability in Singapore today. Yeah, so remind me to explain more about the number question about how many people with disabilities there are in Singapore, and it also tells you about how differently we define people with disabilities. That same issue, right? So back to this. So what I'm saying is that welfare is a key part of the 1940s onwards, and in fact, So this is actually a picture of a welfare home for the disabled. So many, like I say, many welfare homes were set up for the disabled. This was, I think, for intellectually disabled children. I think dating back to the 1960s. Yeah. So, in fact, so one of the things that was set up by the British was, of course, the Social Welfare Department, the FULIBU, and they had very distinct ideas of helping people with disabilities. So if you look at this text, this is actually from their 5-year plan dating back to 1949, and they said it very clearly. The practice of accommodating a handicapped child in normal homes was undesirable as the handicapped child requires specialized treatment and the normal child's education should not be retarded by association with the handicapped. So the sense is very clear, and these are the exact words that is in the 5-year plan. The sense is very clear that for the British government, for the Social Welfare Department, it is very clear how the disabled should be talked about, should be treated. They should be segregated. You shouldn't involve them with a normal population because it will affect the growth of the normal population. So you keep them apart, just segregate them, put them away outside our mind. Like sometimes we deal with our kids, we also want them to be outside our mind. This is worse. So the sense of the 40s and 50s is of that, of welfare, charity, sympathy, pity, segregation. It's very standard kind of things that we see, of course, in what we call the individual model of disability. What changed things slightly is, of course, the 60s. Right? In the 60s, the context was, of course, Singapore became independent. Right? So after 1965 especially, or even earlier, because I think in 1961 we invited the UN to come over to teach us how to industrialize, to build our economy, and it was recommended that we should have factories, and these factories should hire people of Singapore, and we started opening up our land, getting more and more companies to come in, right? So what you see here is actually one of the key architects here, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, and this is actually Jurong in Singapore, and it's the west. And today, if you go to Singapore, it's not like that anymore. This was the Soma, but if you go to Jurong today, it's really very pretty, right? A lot of industrial stuff, factories and everything. So the 60s really saw industrialization happening on a very big scale in Singapore, right? And what I want to say is that as a result, right, rehabilitation, the rehabilitation of people with disabilities became a very big issue in Singapore, right? So, for instance, the Ministry of Social Affairs, which is the ministry in charge of welfare, in 1968 set up a rehabilitation unit, right? They also, at the same time, invited experts from the ILO, from the UN, to come to Singapore to teach Singapore how to do what we call vocational rehabilitation. Right? So getting people with disabilities to be able to go back to work, to be able to perform in as normal a function as possible and go back to work. Right? So in 1975, in fact, we hosted the 5th PAC conference for the International Society for the Rehab of the Disabled. And what is very clear from some of the keynote speakers, here is Benjamin Shears, who was then the president, and he said that to be disabled, whether physically or mentally, is itself a handicap to a living being, but to be thus disabled and not rehabilitated to useful economic and social independence would be tragic. The rehabilitation of the disabled should be the earnest concern of all civic-minded citizens. So you see that concern about rehabilitation comes very strong in the 60s and 70s, no longer about segregation. Now we must help them to be able to perform, right? But of course, there's also a problem. The underlying message is that if they cannot perform, if we don't rehabilitate them, they will be a burden on society, right? And then we have to take care of them. And that's the underlying message. My suspicion is also that rehabilitation in itself is more concerned with people who become disabled, people who have acquired disabilities. And that's something that I think is just a guess of mine. I really haven't seen much historical sources talking about it. But my guess is because industrialization has created more factories, and hence there's higher possibility of accidents in the factories during work. Hence there's a need to rehabilitate people, and that's why there's a lot of attention paid to it. So some of the experts invited in were actually experts invited in by the National Trade Union Congress, which is very much associated with work, but that's something that I can't prove up, but that's my guess. So if you read some of the, so I just want to highlight this point also, right, that if you read some of the disability studies literature, especially from the UK, this guy called Michael Oliver, I'm sure you'll know him, especially if you do disability studies. He actually says this, that rehabilitation itself is founded on an idea of normality. Right? That if you do rehabilitation, your aim is to restore the disabled person to this idea of normality. Right? And that's a problem for him as well. Right? Because then you're not recognizing the person for who he is, what he can do, but what you want him to be able to do. Right? And that in itself is a problem. Okay? So I just wanted to highlight that point. So, what changed? What really changed things was, of course, I would say the 1980s. Right, 1980s internationally, increasingly, there was greater emphasis in the 70s, but it all culminated in the 80s. right? What happened in the 80s? In 1981, you had the International Year of Disabled Persons. So the UN declared 1981 as the IYDP, right? And they came up with a lot of strong messaging about disability, about how we should include people with disabilities, setting out, I think, a UN World Programme for Action subsequently in the 1980s, right? This was also, I think, also a result of movement in the US and the UK. Right? If you look at the UK, it traces even further back, 60s. Probably in the 60s, I think people started talking about why they were segregated, being put apart. And we see a lot of that in the news. And it was also in the 1980s that this became a very big international issue. And Singapore was not different in that sense, right? So what happened? So in Singapore, these are some of the things that were showcased in the 1980s. So look at the bus. This is how the buses look like. You don't see the same kind of buses today, not with the wheelchair, the wheels are. But so even the buses carry posters of the International Year of Disabled Persons, so befriend the disabled, making friends with them. Then we had a series of stamps that came out in the 1980s, right?
Yeah, I used to take this number.
Sorry?
221C.
Oh,
This is in my neighborhood. Yeah, I'm not joking. It's my feeder bus.
Bedok.
Yeah, Bedok.
Yeah, I was guessing so. Yeah. So these were all also stamps that were created. So the right to work, the right to be environmentally active, social integration, the right to education. So International Year of Disabled People in 1981 also happened in Singapore, and there's a reflection of global influences. Right. I think the most interesting thing about Singapore that happened in the 80s was, of course, this. Right. Singapore in 1981 saw the first World Congress of Disabled People's International. Right. So for those of you who don't know what Disabled People's International is, there's actually a story about how DPI, or what I call DPI, was formed. Right? So DPI used to be non-existent. The people in DPI used to be part of this larger international organization called Rehabilitation International, RI. And RI was very concerned with rehabilitation. Right? And they had some people with disabilities in the board. They also had professionals. So people who were occupational therapists, physical therapists, normal people without disabilities, and they had a worldwide kind of representation. So in the 70s, people with disabilities in RI, they wanted to change the constitution of RI such that disabled people became a majority. This was, of course, because they didn't have a majority voice. This was turned down in the 70s, and they decided that they would leave RI and set up an independent organization that would represent people with disabilities and that will run by people with disabilities. Very different from the RI concept where the majority was people without disabilities. So they decided that they would hold the First World Congress, of course by invitation of one of the members there in Singapore. And it was chosen as the venue in 1981. The first chairperson of the first world, the DPI, was actually a Singaporean, and he was the adopted grandfather that I talked about. So Ron Chandran Dadi became the first grandfather, first chairperson of Singapore. So the DPI First World Congress saw the coming together of over 400 delegates, disabled delegates from 50 over countries. And they demonstrated their solidarity. And if you look at the way it's talked about in Singapore, right, this is actually a government minister of social affairs. And you look at the way he talks about disability, it is a very distinct shift from what you see previously. Right? Now it's all about equal opportunities. Right, about how do we work towards achievement of equal opportunities. Very different from, for instance, segregating people, children of disabilities, rehabilitation, restoring them to normality. Now it's about equal opportunities. The immediate impact of the First World Congress, right, that was held in Singapore, was of course that people became more aware of disability issues. Right? And also because the first chairperson was Singaporean, people in Singapore became more vocal in a sense. So the same person here, if you look at this is I cut this off a bit, but Chandran Dali was the first chairperson. He went on to criticize the government, saying that they should be more. They cannot give just lip service to helping people with disabilities. They must take positive action. And you see that, of course, in the newspapers and everything else. So later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that were raised by people with disabilities in the 80s. Okay.